the fern and the touch. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Have you ever noticed how a single moment can change everything? How one small gesture can wake up parts of your heart you thought had gone to sleep forever? This is a story about just such a moment, about a woman, a man, a simple plant, and the magic that happens when two lonely souls discover they don't have to be alone. The old house whispered around me like an old friend sharing secrets. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the settling walls had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. These sounds weren't sad or frightening, they were comforting, like the gentle breathing of someone you love sleeping beside you. This house had been my companion for 30 long years, watching over me through all the seasons of my life. My name is Eleanor, and I've called this place on Willow Creek Lane home for what feels like forever. I've watched spring turn to summer, summer fade to autumn, and winter blanket everything in peaceful white more times than I can count. I've seen fashions change, watched children grow up and move away, and witnessed new families move into the neighborhood while others packed up their memories and left. When I catch my reflection in the dusty hallway mirror these days, I see a woman who has lived. The face looking back at me tells stories. There are gentle lines around my eyes that speak of years of laughter and tears, a softer jawline than the young bride who first walked through these doors with her head full of dreams and her heart full of hope. That young woman had such plans. She was going to paint every room, plant the most beautiful garden, fill every corner with love and laughter. Some of those dreams came true, others changed along the way, and a few were quietly set aside as life took its own course. My husband Tom had been gone for 5 years now. 5 years, sometimes it felt like yesterday, sometimes like a lifetime. The silence he left behind was the loudest thing in the house at first, a roaring emptiness that seemed to echo in every room. But time, as it always does, had worked its slow magic. The sharp edges of grief had worn smooth, leaving behind a dull ache that mostly stayed quiet, only flaring up on special dates or when a familiar smell or an old song caught me off guard. I had found a new rhythm to my days, quieter than before, more solitary. Not lonely, I would tell myself firmly when the house felt too big and too empty. I had my books, stacks of them on every table, old friends waiting to be revisited and new adventures waiting to be discovered. I had my garden, wild and welcoming, where I could lose myself for hours among the flowers and vegetables. And I had my weekly phone calls with my daughter Clara, who lived 2 states away with her own busy life, her own family to tend. The neighbor to my right was Mr. Henderson, or Arthur, as I had learned he preferred after a few careful conversations over the hedge that separated our yards. He had moved in about a year after Tom passed, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself. I knew he was retired, like me. Someone at a neighborhood gathering I had reluctantly attended mentioned he had been a librarian, and that suited him perfectly. He had that thoughtful, careful way about him that made you think he chose his words as carefully as he might choose books for someone to read. His garden was a masterpiece, every plant perfectly placed, every edge neatly trimmed, every flower blooming exactly where it should. It was so different from my own slightly wild patch of earth, which I preferred to think of as having character rather than being messy. Where his garden whispered of order and planning, mine sang of freedom and happy accidents. We were polite neighbors, Arthur and I. We exchanged friendly nods when we happened to be outside at the same time, shared brief conversations about the weather, or complained good-naturedly about the bold squirrel that seemed to think both our bird feeders belonged to him. Nothing deep, nothing personal, just the comfortable distance that neighbors often maintain. He wasn't unfriendly, not at all. There was a kindness in his eyes when he spoke, a gentleness in his voice, but he was contained, like a book with a beautiful cover that you weren't quite sure you were invited to open. I respected that. We all have our private spaces, our quiet corners where we keep the parts of ourselves that are too precious or too fragile to share with just anyone. This particular afternoon, the late spring sun felt like a blessing on my back. The warmth seemed to seep right through my old gardening shirt, easing the stiffness that had settled into my shoulders over the winter months. I was doing battle with a particularly stubborn branch of the climbing rose that had decided to take over the mailbox. It was a magnificent rose, that one Tom's absolute favorite. The blooms were a deep, rich red, so vibrant they seemed to glow against the soft green of the hedge. Every year it grew more ambitious, reaching in every direction as if it wanted to embrace the whole world. I loved its enthusiasm, but it did Need some guidance to keep it from swallowing everything in its path. I snipped and pulled, beads of sweat gathering on my forehead despite the gentle breeze. The air was thick with the perfume of spring freshly cut grass from someone's morning lawn work, the sweet, heady scent of the lilacs blooming beside my front porch, and the green smell of new leaves unfurling on every tree and bush. It was one of those perfect days that made you believe in magic, the kind of day that whispered that anything was possible, that the world was full of wonder if you just knew how to look for it. Even if your own little corner of that world felt a bit too quiet sometimes, a bit too still. I was tugging at a particularly thorny vine, muttering under my breath about roses that didn't know their place, when I heard a soft cough behind me. The sound was so unexpected that I nearly jumped out of my skin, almost dropping my gardening shears in the process. I turned around, a little flustered and probably looking like I'd been wrestling with a bush, which, to be fair, I had been. There was Arthur, standing on his side of the low hedge that marked the boundary between our properties. He was holding a small terracotta pot, and nestled inside was the most delicate little fern I'd ever seen. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was mild, careful, like someone afraid of disturbing a sleeping bird. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." "Oh no, Arthur, not at all," I replied, trying to smooth down my wind-tousled hair with the back of my dirt-covered gardening glove. I probably looked like I'd been dragged through a hedge backward, but his expression was kind. "I was just having a discussion with this overly ambitious rose. It seems to think it owns the entire front yard." He offered a small, shy smile that transformed his whole face. "It's a beautiful bloom," he said, looking at the crimson roses spilling over the hedge. "Vigorous is one word for it," I chuckled, feeling more relaxed now. More like a botanical bully sometimes. "Pretty, but with absolutely no sense of boundaries." He looked down at the pot in his hands, and I noticed his fingers were long and careful. The hands of someone who handled delicate things with respect. I was repotting some of my ferns this morning," he said, and there was something almost boyish in his hesitation. "And this one, well, I seem to have one more than I have space for. I know you enjoy gardening, and I wondered if you might like it. If you have room for another plant, that is." The gesture was so simple, so thoughtful, that it took me by surprise. Our conversations had always been brief, polite, the kind of surface-level exchanges that neighbors share when they're being friendly but not necessarily friends. This felt different, somehow more personal, more real. "Oh, Arthur, that's incredibly thoughtful of you," I said, and I meant it. The warmth in my voice surprised even me. "It's absolutely lovely. Are you sure you don't want to keep it?" "Quite sure," he said, and for just a moment, his gaze met mine directly before flicking back to the fern. "It needs a good home, and I've seen how lovingly you care for your plants. Even that bossy rose of yours gets the attention it needs." I felt something warm spread through my chest, a feeling I hadn't experienced in so long I'd almost forgotten what it was like. It was the simple pleasure of being seen, of having someone notice something about you that you cared about. "Well, thank you so much. I'd be absolutely delighted to give it a home. I think I know just the perfect spot for it on the shaded side of the porch where it can get morning light but stay cool in the afternoon." He stepped closer to the hedge, looking for the best spot to pass the pot through the gap where the branches were thinner. I moved toward him, reaching out to take his gift. Our hands met over that leafy boundary, his fingers brushing against mine as I carefully took hold of the cool ceramic pot. It wasn't a dramatic moment, not the kind of electric shock you read about in romance novels, but it was something, a connection, a brief but unmistakable contact between two people who had been living their lives in careful isolation. His hand was warm, slightly rough from garden work, the hand of someone who wasn't afraid to get his fingers dirty in the soil. My own hand, still in its loose gardening glove, felt clumsy and awkward in comparison. But in that tiny moment when our skin touched, something shifted. It was like a faint electrical current, a gentle hum that I hadn't even realized was missing from my life until I felt it again. The sensation lingered even after our hands parted, leaving a strange, warm impression that seemed to travel up my arm and settle somewhere near my heart. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he was too much of a gentleman to show it. He just smiled again, that quiet, almost apologetic smile that was becoming familiar. "Good," he said simply. "I'm glad it will have a good home." "Thank you again, Arthur," I said, and my voice sounded different to my own ears, warmer, more alive somehow. I cradled the little fern like it was made of spun glass. "It's very kind of you to think of me, My pleasure, Eleanor. He gave a small nod, a little wave of his hand, and then turned back toward his own perfectly maintained garden, leaving me standing there by my unruly rose bush. I stood there for a long moment, the terracotta pot feeling surprisingly significant in my hands. The sun still shone with the same gentle warmth, the birds still sang their afternoon songs, but something in the air around me felt different, charged with a subtle new energy that made everything seem a little brighter, a little more alive. It was such a simple thing, really. A shared interest in growing things, a small gift, a moment when two hands touched over a garden hedge. But as I walked slowly back to my porch, the little fern feeling cool and precious against my palms, I had the strangest feeling that this tiny everyday encounter was anything but ordinary. It felt like the first page of a new chapter in my life, one I hadn't even realized I was ready to begin. The scent of the lilacs seemed sweeter, the silence of the house felt less empty and more expectant, full of quiet possibilities I couldn't quite name. I couldn't explain it, not then. I just knew that something in that gentle brush of hands over a gifted fern had awakened something in me that had been sleeping for a very long time. The fern found its new home on a wicker table on my porch, positioned just where I'd promised, out of the direct sun but where it could catch the gentle morning light. I watered it carefully, my thoughts still circling back to that brief moment at the hedge like a moth drawn to flame. It was silly, really. A man gives his neighbor a plant. It happens every day, all over the world. Neighbors share vegetables from their gardens, cuttings from their flower beds, extra seedlings they don't have room for. It's one of the simple pleasures of living in a community, one of the small ways we take care of each other. But this hadn't felt like just any neighborly gesture. It was the way Arthur had looked, slightly shy and uncertain, as if he was offering more than just a plant. It was the unexpectedness of it, coming from someone I had mentally filed away as the quiet man next door who keeps to himself. And then there was that touch, that brief contact that had left my hand tingling and my heart beating just a little faster. I kept coming back to that moment, turning it over in my mind like a smooth stone you might pick up on a beach and carry in your pocket. It wasn't romantic, not in any obvious way. I wasn't some starry-eyed teenager after all. I was Eleanor, a woman who had lived a full life, who had loved deeply and lost deeply and settled into what I thought was a comfortable, predictable routine. But that touch had felt alive in a way that surprised me. It had stirred something that had been dormant for years, a sense of connection to another human being that I hadn't realized I'd been missing quite so desperately. Later that evening, as dusk began to paint the sky in soft strokes of lavender and rose, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I was curious about someone else's life. I caught myself glancing out the window toward Arthur's house more than once, drawn by the warm glow of light spilling from his living room window. I wondered what he was doing in there. Was he reading? He struck me as the kind of person who would have a favorite chair, a good lamp, maybe a cup of tea growing cold on a side table as he lost himself in a book. What kind of books did he read? Did he have family somewhere? Children who called him on Sundays, grandchildren who sent him drawings and photos? For the first time since he'd moved in, he wasn't just Mr. Henderson, the polite neighbor with the perfect garden. He was Arthur, a man who had noticed that I loved plants and had chosen to share one of his own with me. He was someone with thoughts and feelings and a life that suddenly seemed interesting in a way I hadn't expected. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and settled on the porch, positioning myself where I could admire the little fern in its new home. The air was cooling as night approached, carrying the scent of damp earth and the sweet perfume of night-blooming jasmine from somewhere down the street. The cricket orchestra had begun its nightly performance, a symphony of chirps and trills that seemed to celebrate the end of another day. It was a completely ordinary evening, the kind I'd experienced hundreds of times before. Yet it felt different somehow, imbued with a quiet anticipation that made me feel more awake, more present than I had in years. I hadn't felt this way since Tom. Since the early days of our marriage, when everything seemed possible and the future stretched ahead of us like an unwritten story. It wasn't excitement, exactly I was told and too wise for that kind of giddy feeling. It was more like gentle curiosity, a sense of a door that had been closed for so long beginning to creak open just a crack, showing me a glimpse of something new and unexpected beyond. And it had all started with a simple fern and the touch of hands over a garden hedge. I smiled to myself as I sipped my tea, a small, private smile that felt rusty from disuse. Perhaps, I thought, even quiet lives on quiet streets could hold their own kind of magic. Perhaps it was never too late for new chapters, new connections, new possibilities to bloom like unexpected flowers in the garden of an ordinary life. The next morning brought a shift in my internal weather that was as noticeable as the difference between a cloudy day and a sunny one. I woke with a sense of lightness I hadn't felt in years, a feeling that something good was possible in the world. It was peculiar, this change in my mood, all stemming from such a small incident the day before. As I went about my usual morning routine, coffee first. Always coffee first, then the newspaper, then a bit of straightening up around the house. I found my gaze drifting again and again to the little fern on the porch. It looked healthy and content in its new home, its delicate fronds catching the morning light. It was like a small green reminder of yesterday's brief but meaningful connection. Halfway through my second cup of coffee, I was struck by an impulse I hadn't felt in months. I wanted to bake something. Baking had been such a big part of my life when Tom was alive, when the children were young and the house was full of people who needed feeding and caring for. Lately, it had seemed like too much trouble for just one person. Why make a whole batch of muffins when there was only me to eat them? But today was different. Today I wanted to fill the kitchen with good smells, wanted to feel useful and productive in that particular way that comes from creating something delicious with your own hands. And maybe, just maybe, I could take one over to Arthur as a thank you for the fern. The thought made my heart do a little flutter, which was ridiculous. I was a grown woman, a widow who had managed her own life for 5 years now. Taking a muffin to a neighbor was hardly a momentous event. Yet there was something about the idea of initiating contact, of stepping outside my comfortable routine, and reaching across that hedge between our properties, that felt both scary and exciting. I decided on lemon poppy seed muffins, a recipe I'd been making for so many years I could probably do it in my sleep. As I measured flour and sugar, as I zested fresh lemons and watched the bright yellow curls fall into the bowl, the kitchen began to fill with the kind of warm, cheerful aroma that makes a house feel like a home. I found myself humming as I worked. An old song that Tom used to sing while he shaved in the mornings. The melody felt good in my throat, and I realized I hadn't hummed in a very long time. It was another small sign of this strange new lightness that had settled over me like a comfortable shawl. Perhaps I'll take one over to Arthur, I said out loud to the empty kitchen, testing how the words sounded. They sounded good, natural, like something a friendly neighbor would do. The thought of seeing his face when I showed up at his door, of maybe being invited in for a few minutes of conversation, sent a warm flutter through my chest. Once the muffins were out of the oven, golden brown and fragrant enough to make my mouth water, I arranged 3 of them on my best small plate, the one with the tiny blue flowers around the rim. I covered them with a clean tea towel and took a deep breath. Right, Eleanor, I said to my reflection in the hall mirror. It's just a muffin. Just a simple thank you from one neighbor to another. But my hands were slightly shaky as I smoothed my hair and checked to make sure I didn't have flour on my shirt. The walk across my lawn to his front door felt longer than it should have. The grass was still jeweled with morning dew that soaked through my canvas shoes, and his house looked even more pristine from the front than it did from the back. Well-tended flower beds lined the walkway, and his front porch had been recently painted a welcoming shade of sage green. I hesitated for just a moment on his doorstep, suddenly aware of how long it had been since I'd made this kind of social gesture. Then I lifted my hand and gave a light, friendly knock. I heard footsteps inside, and then the door opened. Arthur stood there, looking genuinely surprised to see me. He was dressed in a simple collared shirt and comfortable slacks, his silver hair neatly combed as always. He held a book in one hand, his finger marking his place between the pages. Eleanor, he said, and I caught something in his eyes. Was it pleasure? Or just polite curiosity? This is unexpected. Good morning, Arthur, I replied, hoping my voice sounded more casual than I felt. I baked some muffins this morning, and I thought you might like one. As a thank you for that lovely fern, it's settling in beautifully on the porch. I held out the plate, and his expression shifted, softening into that quiet smile I was beginning to recognize. Lemon poppy seed, he said, and there was something almost wondering in his voice. That's very thoughtful of you, Eleanor, and they happen to be one of my absolute favorites. The coincidence felt like a small gift, a sign that I'd made the right choice. Really? How wonderful. Well then, I'm doubly glad I decided to make them. He stepped back from the door, gesturing for me to come in. Please, come in for a moment if you have time. I was just making some tea, perhaps you'd like a cup? The invitation was so unexpected that I almost said no out of pure habit, but something in his voice, something warm and genuine, made me nod instead. Just for a minute then, if you're sure I'm not interrupting anything important. Interrupting your reading? Not at all. A welcome interruption. He stepped back, holding the door wider. His living room was just as he'd imagined in a way. Bookshelves lined almost every wall, filled to capacity, comfortable, slightly worn armchairs, a lingering scent of old paper and lemon polish. It was a cozy intellectual haven, not sterile, but thoughtfully organized. There were no family photos immediately visible, I noticed, but there were several interesting pieces of art on the walls, prints of botanical drawings and old maps. Please have a seat. He gestured towards an armchair. Can I offer you some coffee? I just made a fresh pot. Oh no thank you, I've had my fill this morning, I said, settling into the chair. It was surprisingly comfortable. Your home is lovely. Are there so many books? He chuckled, a soft warm sound, a professional hazard. I suppose he and a lifelong passion there. Good company, I agree, I said, though my collection is a bit more chaotic. He took the plate of muffins and placed it on a small side table. These smell wonderful. Thank you again. He picked one up. May I? Of course. He took a bite and his eyes closed for a moment in appreciation. Delicious, Eleanor. Truly. You have a gift. I felt a blush creep up my neck. It was such a simple compliment. Booth's sincerity made it feel significant. It's just an old recipe. Wes said in comfortable silence for a moment, him savoring the muffin, me taking in the quiet atmosphere of his home. It was so different from my own, which despite my forts still bore the imprint of family life, of Tom's presence, of lingering memories. Arthur's home felt like his own, curated by a singular taste and a quiet life. So a librarian, I ventured, remembering the snippet of information. He nodded. For 40 years, university library, mostly. I retired last spring. Do you miss it? He paused, looking out the window for a moment as if considering the question. Carefully, I miss parts of it, the smell of the archives, the thrill of finding a rare first edition, helping students find just the right piece of information. But he turned back to me, a faint smile on his lips. I don't miss the budget meetings or the endless cataloging system updates. I laughed. I can imagine. And you, Eleanor? You're retired too, I gather? Yes. I was a primary school teacher. Second grade, mostly. I loved it, but it was time. The energy levels record. I trailed off, smiling. Shaping young minds, a noble profession, he said, more demanding than dusty books. I'm sure both have their rewards, I expect, I replied. We talked for a little while longer about books we'd read, about the changing neighborhood, about the surprising tenacity of dandelions. It was easy conversation, flowing naturally without any awkward silences. I learned he'd moved here from a busier part of the state after his retirement, seeking a quieter pace. He didn't mention a wife or family, and I didn't pry. It wasn't my place, but I found myself wanting to know more about this gentle, thoughtful man who lived next door, who liked lemon poppy seed muffins and had given me a fern. When I finally stood to leave, feeling I'd taken up enough of his morning, he walked me to the door. Thank you again for the muffins, Eleanor. It was a real treat, and thank you for the fern, Arthur, and for the conversation. The pleasure was all mine. He paused, then added, perhaps we could share a cup of coffee sometime in a more planned fashion. My heart gave another little leap. I'd like that very MacArthur. Wonderful. I'll be in touch. As I walked back to my own house, the sun felt warmer, the colors in my garden seemed brighter. The world hadn't changed, not really, but I had, or at least something within me had, a small seed of connection planted by a fern and nurtured by a muffin, and a quiet conversation was beginning to sprout, and I found myself looking forward to whatever might grow from it. The silence in my house when I stepped back inside didn't feel quite so profound anymore. It felt expectant, waiting. Just like me, the days that followed had a new texture to them. The quiet anticipation I'd felt after receiving the fern didn't dissipate. Instead, it settled into a gentle undercurrent in my daily life. I found myself noticing small things, the way the light hit Arthur's wind chimes in the late afternoon, the particular shade of blue of the hydrangeas he was carefully tending near his porch, the surrent obsessive thoughts. Just a heightened awareness, a subtle shift in focus from my own inner world to the small details of the world outside, particularly the corner of it occupied by my neighbor. A few days after the muffin exchange, a small handwritten note appeared in my mailbox, not tucked in with the bills and flyers, but placed carefully on top. The handwriting was neat, slightly old-fashioned, unmistakably Arthur's. It simply read, "Eleanor, would you be freed for that coffee on Friday morning, perhaps around 10 o'clock? My porch, if the weather holds, Arthur. My porch, if the weather holds." It was such a simple, unassuming invitation, yet it made me smile all day. Friday that gave me 2 days too well. I wasn't sure what it wasn't a dotty not in the way I remember dates from my youth or even the occasional accord Setup's friends had tried to arrange after Tom passed. This felt different, gentler, just coffee with Arthur on Friday morning. I took a little more care with my appearance than usual, nothing dramatic, just a nicer blouse, a touch of lipstick I rarely bothered with anymore. I told myself it was just to feel presentable, but a small, honest voice inside admitted, I wanted to look nice. Is for him. Asterisk. The weather, thankfully, was holding beautifully. A perfect late spring morning, sunny, with a light breeze that rustled the leaves in the old oak tree at the end of the street. At precisely 10 o'clock I walked over. Arthur was already in his porch, which was a mirror image of mine but furnished with sturdy dark wickered chairs and of course more plants. A small table was set with mugs, a steaming coffee carafe, a small pitcher of cream, and a plate of what looked like homemade shortbread cookies. "Good morning, Eleanor," he greeted, rising from his chair. He was wearing a crisp, pale blue shirt, and he looked nice, relaxed. "Good morning, Arthur. This is lovely," I said, gesturing to the setup. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "No trouble at all. A pleasure." He gestured for me to sit, "and I must confess your muffins inspired me. These are my attempt at shortbread, a bit rustic, I'm afraid. They look wonderful," I assured him. "Anthe did." He poured the coffee, rich and dark, the aroma mingling with the scent of his well-tended garden. We sat sipping our coffee, making small talk. Initially the weather, a noisy blue jay that was squawking indignantly from a nearby tree, the progress of my battle with the crimson rose, but gradually the conversation deepened, meandering like a slow river. He asked about Clara, my daughter, and listened with genuine interest as I talked about her work as a veterinarian and her 2 boisterous rescue dogs. I found myself sharing anecdotes I hadn't recounted in years, feeling a lightness in the telling. He in turn spoke a little about his career, the changes he'd seen in the world of libraries and information. He mentioned a sister who lived in Oregon, whom he visited once a year. He spoke of her fondly, but there was a hint of melancholy when he talked about family, a subtle sense that he too understood solitude. There were moments of comfortable silence, too. We'd watch a bee bumble amongst his lavender bushes or listen to the distant sound of children laughing. It wasn't an awkward silence but a shared quiet, a sense of mutual ease that was surprisingly profound. He realized how long it had been since I'd simply sat with another person, a man, and just been without expectation, without the weight of shared history or unspoken grief. At one point he was talking about a particularly memorable rare book he had once acquired for the university library, a medieval manuscript with exquisite illuminations. His eyes lit up as he described it, his hands subtly gesturing, as if he could still feel the ancient vellum. "It sounds fascinating," I said. "You must miss having access to such treasures." He looked at me, his gaze direct and thoughtful. "I do, in some ways." But he paused, a small smile playing on his lips. "There are other kinds of treasures, aren't there? Smaller perhaps, but no less valuable." His eyes flicked briefly around his garden, then met mine again. I felt that now familiar warmth spread through me. His words, simple as they were, resonated deeply. He understood. He saw value in the equipments and the beauty of a well-tended garden in a shared cup of coffee on a sunny morning. As I was about to take a sip of my coffee, my hand brushed against this as we both reached for the plate of shortbread cookies. At the same time, another accidental touch, lighter evident than the one over the hedge, just a fleeting contact of our fingers. But this time I was more aware, more attuned to the sensation. His skin was warm. For a heartbeat neither of us moved. Then, as if by mutual, unspoken agreement, we both drew our hands back slightly, a little ripple of awareness passing between us. "Oh, excuse me," I murmured, feeling a faint blush. "My apologies," he said. His voice was equally soft. He picked up a cookie and offered the plate to me. "Please." Our eyes met, and in that moment I saw something flicker in his, a reflection of the same subtle electricity. I felt it wasn't just politeness, it was recognition, an acknowledgement of that tiny invisible spark. The conversation resumed, perhaps a shade more careful for a few moments, but the ease soon returned. Yet something had subtly shifted again. That second touch, as brief and inconsequential as it might seem, had confirmed the quiet hum of connection I'd felt before. It was real, and it was nice. More than nice, it was like finding a hidden spring in a familiar landscape, cool and refreshing. When it was time for me to leave an hour and a half later, I felt a reluctance I hadn't anticipated. "Thank you for the coffee, Arthur," I said, standing up. "And the delightful company. Our shortbread is excellent, by the way, far from rustic." "The pleasure was all mine, Eleanor," he replied, walking with me to the edge of his porch. Perhaps he hesitated, then continued, a hopeful note in his voice. "We could do this again some time. I would like that very much," I said, and this time the words came out with more confidence, more certainty. As I walked back to my own house, I felt a lightness in my step, a song in my heart that had been silent for too long. The world around me seemed to be humming with a gentle energy. It wasn't just about a potential friendship, if that was certainly part of it. It was about feeling seen, truly seen by another person. It was about the unexpected joy of discovering a kindred spirit right next door, hidden in plain sight all this time. The subtle tension off, our accidental touches, the shared glances, the easy flow of conversation, it all pointed to something new, something that felt both exciting and wonderfully calm. My quiet life was beginning to feel a little less quiet and a lot more interesting, and I realized with a sense of quiet wonder that I was genuinely looking forward to whatever came next. The rhythm of our interactions found a natural, unhurried pace after that first coffee on Arthur's porch. There were no grand declarations, no sudden shifts, just a gentle unfolding psalmodies. It would be a shared few minutes over the hedge, discussing the progress of our respective gardens, my roses, his meticulously tended tomatoes. He'd offer advice on dealing with aphid sand. I'd share a particularly good bloom from my prize-winning dahlia. Other times, one of us would find an excuse for a slightly longer chat. I accidentally made too much zucchini bread. He happened to have an extra copy of a gardening magazine. He thought I'd enjoy. These small exchanges became anchor points in me, weak, quiet moments of connection that I found myself anticipating with a surprising degree of pleasure. We learned more about each other. In these snippets of conversation, I discovered he had a dry wit that surfaced unexpectedly, making me laugh out loud. He learned about millefleur, though mostly dormant passion for watercolor painting, something I hadn't picked up a brush for in years. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after our coffee, I was struggling to carry a heavy bag of mulch from my car to the backyard. My back had been twing a bit and I was probably overdoing it. Suddenly Arthur was there, emerging from his front door as if summoned by my silent grunts of effort. "Eleanor, let me help you with that," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Oh, Arthur, no, I'm fine, just being stubborn," I protested, though relief was already washing over me. He didn't argue, just gently took the bag from my hands. "Nonsense. That's far too heavy for one person. Where would you like it?" His proximity as he stood beside me was noticeable. He wasn't a large man, but he had a solid presence. I caught a faint pleasant scent, something like old books and freshly turned earth. Uniquely Arthur, as he easily lifted the bag I'd struggled with, I felt a pain of something akin to gratitude, but also a warmth that had little to do with the saved effort. "Just by the new flower near the maple tree, if you would. Thank you so much, Arthur. You are a lifesaver." He carried it with an ease that surprised me, then set it down carefully. "Happy to be of service." He put his hands on his trousers, then looked at the half-prepared bed, putting in some new perennials. "Trying to," I said, rubbing my lower back. "My enthusiasm sometimes outstrips my physical capabilities these days." He gave a sympathetic smile. "I know the feeling. The spirit is willing, but the flesh protests." He paused, then said, "If you ever need a hand with the heavier work, Eleanor, please don't hesitate to ask. I have the time, and frankly, I enjoy a bit of physical labor. Keeps the joints from seizing up." His offer was so genuine, so straightforward, it disarmed me. "That's incredibly kind of you, Arthur. I might just take you up on that sometime. I hope you too." His gaze lingered on mine for a moment, a flicker of something warm and unreadable in his eyes before he nodded. "Well, I'll let you get back to it then." As he walked back to his house, I watched him go, feeling a complex mix of emotions. There was gratitude, decidedly, but there was also a growing sense of something more, a fondness, a deep appreciation for his quiet strength, his unassuming kindness. It wasn't just neighborly necessity. This felt like the careful tending of a new, delicate plant. A friendship, perhaps. Or maybe something given more nuanced. Something that didn't quite have a name yet. The following Saturday I was out on my porch, sketchbook in hand for the first time in what felt like a decade, inspired by our conversations and perhaps by the subtle stirring of new feelings. I'd unearthed my old art supplies. I was attempting to capture the play of light on the ferns Arthur had given me, the original one, and a couple more he'd since passed over, thehage spares from his ever-expanding collection. My hand felt clumsy and sure, but there was a quiet joy in the simple act of observing, of trying to translate what I saw onto paper. I was so absorbed I didn't hear Arthur approach until his shadow fell over my sketchbook. I looked up, startled, a little embarrassed to be caught in my rusty attempt at art. "Oh, Arthur, I didn't hear you. Forgive me for startling you, Eleanor," he said, his voice soft. He was holding a plate covered with a napkin. "I saw you out here, and I'm out of scones, clotted cream and strawberry jam included." He lifted the napkin to reveal perfectly golden scones. My heart did a little flip. Scrumptious rustic shortbread had been divine. "Arthur, you spoil me," I said, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. "They look incredible." "I was hoping you might think so." He hesitated for a moment. "May I join you? Or am I interrupting your creative process?" He glanced at my sketchbook. "Not at all, please. Sit." I gestured to the chair beside me, quickly closing the sketchbook. "And you're not interrupting anything, just witnessing a very rusty artist trying to remember how to hold a pencil." He sat down, placing the scones between us. "I think it's wonderful that you're drawing again. You mentioned you enjoyed it." "I used to," I admitted. "Life just got in the way. But lately I felt the urge to try again." I looked at him. "You've been rather inspiring, with your garden, your books, your appreciation for the quiet things." A faint flush rose on his cheeks. "I hardly think I've done anything inspirational." "Oh, but you have," I insisted gently. "Sometimes it's the quiet inspirations that make the biggest difference." He looked pleased, a soft smile gracing his lips as he served the scones, carefully spooning generous dollops of cream and jam. Our hands brushed again. This time it felt less accidental, more like a natural consequence of our proximity, of the comfortable intimacy that was slowly building between us. The touch was brief, light as a feather, but it sent a familiar shiver of awareness through. I glanced at him, and his eyes met mine, a shared and spoken acknowledgement of the gentle current that flowed between us. There was no awkwardness this time, just a quiet understanding. We ate the scones, which were, of course, heavenly, and talked not about anything profound, just the small details of our lives, our thoughts, our observations. He told me about a fascinating documentary he'd watched on migratory birds. I told him about a funny phone call I'd had with Clara involving a misbehaving parrot at her clinic. The conversation flowed, effortless, slip and tape by comfortable silences and shared smiles. As the afternoon light began, Tomolo, casting long shadows across the lawn, a sense of deep contentment settled over me. Sitting there on my porch with this kind, intelligent, gentle man, sharing scones in quiet conversation, felt right. It felt like Agift. "Arthur," I said, as he was preparing to leave, "thank you for the scones, for the company, for everything." He paused at the porch steps, turning back to me. His expression was serious, his gaze direct. "Eleanor," he began, his voice a little deeper than usual, "the pleasure truly is all mine. These moments, they mean a great deal to me." His words, so simple, so sincere, resonated deep within me. "They mean a great deal to me too," I thought, though I didn't say it aloud. Booty hoped he could see it in my eyes. He gave me a small, almost shy smile, then turned and walked back towards his own house. I watched him go, the plate, flipped over, scones still on the table, my half-finished sketch beside it. The air felt charged, not with tension, but with a beautiful, quiet energy, a sense of possibility. I picked up my pencil again, not to sketch the ferns, but to trace the rim of the teacup he'd used, the touch of our hands, the warmth in his eyes, his quiet words. They all swirled together in my mind, creating a feeling of profound emotional connection. It wasn't the dramatic, heart-pounding agreement of my youth. This was something quieter, deeper, more resonant. It was a connection forged in shared solitude, mutual respect, and the unexpected joy of late life discovery. And as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that what was growing between Arthur and me was something truly special. It was changing everything, not by appending my world, but be gently, beautifully enriching.